Summer 1943. The Pacific sun burned so fiercely that it seemed to erase shadows, bleaching the horizon into a haze of white heat. The women shuffled forward, their bare feet scraping coral dust from the road, each step sending needles into already blistered skin. Sweat streaked down their temples, cutting rivers through grime. They were nurses, clerks, widows, a tangle of weary souls pulled from the wreckage of surrender. Fear marched alongside them, silent and heavier than the rifles slung across the shoulders of the American guards who kept pace. The air was alive with contradictions. The buzz of flies circling wounds, the scent of salt brine from the nearby ocean, the faint sweetness of tobacco from the soldier at the front of the line. None of it matched the warnings etched into their minds by years of propaganda. They had been told the Americans were beasts, hunters of flesh, desecrators of purity. They expected jeers, beatings, perhaps the end of their lives at the edge of a ditch. Yet what they saw were young men, not monsters, their helmets tipped back, their boots scuffed, their expressions more curious than cruel. Aiko Tanaka stumbled as her knees gave way, and she would have fallen face first into the coral had a rough hand not caught her arm. She flinched, certain it was the blow that would end her, but instead she found herself staring into pale eyes squinting against the sun. The guard's voice was thick with a drawl she had never heard before. "Easy there, ma'am," he muttered, more to himself than to her, before nudging her forward again. His name, though she did not yet know it, was John Collins, called Red by his comrades for the tint of his hair when the light caught it. Beside Aiko walked Sachiko Nakamura, a widow who wore grief like armor. Her husband had died 2 years before on the fields of China, and she had carried his ashes in a small pouch until capture forced her to discard them. She had not wept since. Her lips pressed into a line so tight it seemed carved in stone. Her gaze fixed on the horizon as though looking beyond the enemy, beyond humiliation. She muttered under her breath words of defiance, not prayers. Japan would never bow, not even here. The gates of the camp appeared like a mirage, barbed wire glinting like silver threads, watchtowers stabbing at the sky. The women braced themselves. What waited inside? Torture chambers, cages, the cruel theater of vengeance? They tightened their fists, whispering to each other that endurance was the last weapon left to them. And then came the sound, a clink, a fizz, the unmistakable pop of glass against glass. Soldiers were unloading crates from a truck parked near the mess tent. The bottles inside gleamed brown and translucent, their necks capped with metal crowns that caught the light. Ice rattled around them, carried in sacks that steamed in the heat. One bottle was opened, and as the cap hissed away, the liquid inside bubbled and frothed, a sweetness perfuming the air. The women froze. This was no execution, no grisly trick. This was Coca-Cola. The guards grinned, handing bottles to each other. One tilted his head back and drank, amber liquid catching the sun as it poured down his throat. A sound escaped him, half sigh, half groan of delight. Then came laughter, music spilling from a nearby gramophone, the swing rhythm of Benny Goodman swirling into the humid air. It was a carnival where the women had expected a gallows. Aiko's stomach clenched. Hunger had hollowed her body until even her bones seemed light, and the smell of something cooking drifted toward her now, meat searing on a hot plate, fat spitting into fire. Her throat closed. She told herself she would refuse, that her body might betray her but her spirit would not. Yet when she inhaled again, she could almost taste it, salt and char, the memory of a feast she had never known. Collins barked orders, guiding the women toward the camp square. He was tall, with a shambling gait that betrayed a cowboy's swagger. He chewed tobacco as though it were part of his jaw. When he noticed their stares fixed on the bottles, he let out a small laugh. "Ain't poison, ladies. Just soda pop." The words meant nothing to them, but his tone carried a peculiar softness. Sachiko glared at him, her eyes burning with scorn. To her, this was the enemy's game. Feed the prisoners until their gratitude dulled the blade of loyalty. She whispered to Aiko, "Do not drink. Do not eat. This is how they kill without killing." But another voice broke through, calm, accented but clear. It belonged to Sergeant Maria Alvarez, a Red Cross nurse stationed at the camp. She carried bandages tucked under one arm, her dark hair pulled tight beneath a cap. "You must eat," she urged in careful Japanese, learned just enough from hospital wards. "You must live." The women were herded into rows, sat upon wooden benches. Plates appeared, soft buns split open, patties of beef glistening with grease, pickles sliced thin, mustard spread sharp. Steam rose into the air, mingling with the faint perfume of the Coke bottles. It was obscene in its abundance. The first woman lifted the hamburger, trembling. She bit down, and a sound escaped her, a choking sob, muffled by bread. Another followed, and another, until tears streaked across faces dirted by weeks of marches and fear. They cried as they chewed, cried as though each swallow were both betrayal and blessing. The Coca-Cola followed, bubbles stinging tongues and used to sweetness. For some, the taste was unbearable, a reminder of everything stolen from them. For others, it was salvation disguised in glass. Aiko resisted at first, staring at the plate before her as though it might erupt in flames. Collins crouched nearby, elbows resting on his knees. "Ain't gonna bite back," he said, pointing at the food. She raised her eyes, studied his face, the freckles, the squint, the absence of cruelty. Slowly, as if testing forbidden ground, she lifted the burger to her lips. The warmth spread through her like fire on cold hands. Her tears came unbidden, hot and humiliating. She turned away, ashamed of herself. Sachiko, however, pushed her plate aside. Her jaw set, she whispered fiercely, "I would rather starve than swallow their victory." Yet her eyes betrayed her hunger, darting toward the food even as she spat in its direction. Night fell, and the camp lights flickered on. The women lay in barracks where wooden bunks stretched row after row. The air was thick with the scent of soap and disinfectant, luxuries, yet strange in their sterility. Aiko lay awake, the taste of beef still on her tongue, hating herself for wanting more. Across the room, Sachiko whispered prayers of vengeance, clutching at the memory of her husband as if his ghost would protect her from corruption. In the shadows outside, Collins smoked a cigarette. Maria Alvarez passed by, pausing to glance at the barracks. "They cried," she said softly. "Yeah," Collins replied, flicking ash into the dust. "First time I ever saw a hamburger break a person." He tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat. Somewhere beyond the wire, artillery rumbled in the distance, a reminder that this strange theater of mercy existed in the heart of war. Inside, Aiko closed her eyes. She had tasted the enemy's bread and wept for it. In her dreams, she saw her mother's kitchen, smelled rice cooking, heard the voices of home. But when she woke, the taste that lingered was not of rice, but of charred beef and soda bubbles. Sachiko rolled over, watching her from across the barracks. Her face lit faintly by moonlight through slats. "You are forgetting already," she hissed. Aiko said nothing. She could not confess what she knew, that for one brief, unbearable moment, she had not felt like a prisoner but simply a woman with a full stomach. And in that fragile truth lay a greater terror than any rifle. The first dawn inside the wire came with the scrape of metal boots on gravel and the whistle of a guard who sounded more weary than fierce. The barracks groaned awake. Boards creaked as women rolled from straw mattresses still damp with salt sweat from the march. Aiko sat up slowly, disoriented by the absence of insects that had plagued them in the jungle. The air smelled of soap and burned coffee, scents so foreign to captivity that they felt like tricks. For a long moment she wondered if this place was a mirage that might vanish if she blinked too hard. The women shuffled into a line, eyes cast downward. They passed under the thin shadow of barbed wire, the towers looming overhead like skeletal giants. Beyond the fence, palm trees swayed with indifference, the Pacific's horizon stretching blue and endless. Inside, the camp was a grid of wooden huts, clotheslines, and dirt paths carefully raked by soldiers. It was strangely orderly, as though humiliation had been architected with precision. At the mess tent, the women were handed trays. Steam rose from bowls of porridge flecked with sugar, beside slices of canned peaches that glowed like sunlight captured in syrup. The Americans moved with mechanical ease, ladling food as if they were serving at a summer fair. Aiko's stomach coiled. She wanted to refuse, yet hunger dragged her forward. When the spoon touched her lips, the sweetness overwhelmed her, thick, golden, almost obscene in its richness. Tears threatened, and she swallowed them down with the peaches. Across from her, Sachiko pushed her tray away. Her dark eyes hardened with defiance as she whispered to the women nearest her. This food is poison. It kills honor. The words traveled down the line like a warning. Yet even as she spoke, her gaze lingered on the peaches until she forced herself to look away. Collins watched from the edge of the tent, hands on his hips. His mouth twisted, not in cruelty but in something close to bemusement. "They act like we're feeding them gold," he muttered to Maria Alvarez, who stood beside him, clipboard pressed to her chest. Maria, already noting the women's thin frames and sores, gave no reply. She was focused on their ribs, their skin, the fragility of bones beneath too thin flesh. Later, in the infirmary, Maria coaxed the women one by one to stand on scales. Her Spanish-tinged English was slow, careful, sometimes softened with halting Japanese she had memorized from a Red Cross pamphlet. "Weight better," she said, patting her own hip to demonstrate. Most of the women obeyed reluctantly, except Sachiko, who refused to remove her ragged jacket, glaring at the nurse as if the very request were an assault. "You want me naked before enemy eyes?" she hissed. Maria did not flinch. She placed a blanket across the scale and said, "Then keep it. But I will still count." Their eyes locked, neither yielding, until finally Sachiko stepped onto the platform. Numbers clicked into place, indifferent to her fury. Aiko, waiting her turn, watched this exchange with a shiver of unease. Something inside her envied Sachiko's fire, even as her own body betrayed her with its longing for food, for rest, for the very comfort she was supposed to despise. The days began to gather rhythm. Roll call at dawn, meals at precise hours, barracks inspections that felt more like rituals than punishments. The Americans issued soap and toothbrushes, commanding them to scrub until skin flushed pink. The women, stripped of lice and grime, were left raw, exposed not only in body but in spirit. They had been told they would lose dignity in captivity, but no one had warned that dignity might be stolen by cleanliness, by the quiet seduction of hot water running over dirt that had clung for months. Aiko wrote in a scrap of notebook paper smuggled from the infirmary, "I washed today with soap that smelled of lavender. I hated myself for liking it. My hands are softer, but my heart feels weaker." At night, the gramophone played from the American quarters. Swing music floated through the air, violins and horns colliding in jubilant defiance of silence. The women huddled on their bunks, pretending not to listen. Yet feet tapped unconsciously, fingers drummed softly against wood. Sachiko scolded them, "Do not let the enemy's music into your blood." But once, in the dim candlelight, Aiko glimpsed Sachiko's head tilt ever so slightly, as though straining to hear a saxophone's cry. One evening, Collins brought a baseball bat into the women's yard. He motioned with exaggerated gestures, demonstrating how to swing. The ball cracked against wood and soared into the sky, disappearing beyond the wire. He laughed and shouted something about home runs. The women stared in bafflement. When Aiko was nudged forward to try, she lifted the bat like a spear. "This is also a weapon, yes?" she said cautiously. The soldiers chuckled, though not unkindly. Collins shook his head. "Only if you don't like the pitcher." The joke meant little, but his smile did something strange inside her, like heat sliding beneath skin long chilled. Humor became a crack in the wall. Once, Maria tried to make miso from ketchup and hot water for the women. They watched in silence as she stirred the red liquid, steam curling upward. Aiko sipped, grimaced, then laughed despite herself. A sharp, sudden laugh she clapped a hand over, horrified. Soon the others laughed too, a desperate, almost manic sound. Even Sachiko smiled for an instant before quickly hardening her face again. But under the surface, guilt gnawed. Letters arrived through Red Cross channels, censored and delayed, fragments of lives back in Japan. Women learned of families bombed, of children starving, of homes turned to rubble. They held these letters in trembling hands while still tasting the sugar of peaches, the grease of beef. The contrast was unbearable. Some confessed at night to one another, "I feel shame every time I eat. My brother may be dying while I grow heavier." Others lashed out in silence, smashing Coke caps against the ground, hiding them like cursed charms. Aiko found herself drifting between two worlds. In one, she whispered with Sachiko, rehearsing loyalty, cursing the enemy. In the other, she listened to Maria's halting Japanese, learned English words, bread, water, sleep. each word lodged in her mind like contraband, proof of treachery to her homeland. She could not decide which was more dangerous, hunger of the body or hunger of the heart. Collins, too, became part of her confusion. She caught him once staring at a photograph tucked in his wallet, his brother in uniform, smiling. When he saw her watching, his face shuddered, but not before she glimpsed grief as raw as her own. Later, when he caught her staring at the barbed wire under moonlight, he muttered, "Ain't no prettier from the outside." She understood nothing of the words, yet his tone reached her, deep and bruised. One night, as the barracks slept, Sachiko whispered fiercely to Aiko, "Do not forget. Every bite of their food kills your loyalty. Every smile weakens your spine. They want us to soften, to forget who we are." Aiko turned, but the words lodged in her chest like thorns. The following morning, Maria gathered the women for sewing lessons. She produced needles, thread, and scraps of cloth, coaxing them into making small garments. Fingers stiff with disuse began to move again. The women stitched in silence, yet something stirred, a memory of civilian life, of softness once allowed. Maria hummed a lullaby in Spanish, her voice steady as the women's hands moved. For a moment, the barracks no longer felt like a prison but like a circle of sisters, gathered around an invisible hearth. Then a distant rumble shattered the calm. Planes droned overhead, too far to strike but close enough to remind them all that the war still clawed at the sky. The women froze, needles pausing mid-stitch. Maria's song broke off, leaving the silence raw. Collins shouted orders outside, his drawl sharp with tension. Aiko's chest tightened. The sound of engines dragged her back to nights in Manila, hiding beneath rubble as bombs shook the earth. She gripped the cloth in her hands until her knuckles whitened. Across from her, Sachiko's face lit with something that looked almost like hope, as if the noise promised Japan's shadow still stretched across the heavens. The planes passed. The women returned to their sewing, but the moment had carved itself deep. Their world was still under siege, even inside this strange sanctuary of peaches and soap. That night, Aiko dreamed of rice simmering in her mother's kitchen, of tatami mats warm beneath her knees. But when she woke, the taste on her tongue was still American coffee, bitter and black, lingering like an accusation. She lay awake long after the others had drifted to sleep, staring at the moonlight spilling through the cracks of the barracks. Sachiko stirred, her whisper slicing through the dark. "You are forgetting. I can see it in your eyes." Aiko closed her own eyes, pretending to sleep. But inside, she knew Sachiko was right. Something was shifting, quietly, inexorably. And once it shifted too far, there would be no return. The weeks inside the wire began to stretch into months, though time there had a peculiar rhythm, part clockwork, part dream. For the Japanese women, each morning carried the scent of frying bacon and brewing coffee, reminders that their captors lived by abundance. The guards moved with an ease that seemed casual but was never careless. For the prisoners, life became a daily duel between hunger and pride, between survival and the gnawing fear of betrayal to their homeland. Aiko felt the shift first in her body. Her arms filled out again, no longer sticks but limbs with some memory of strength. Her cheeks lost their hollow edges. Each improvement, however, felt like a confession. She ate, she slept, she washed in hot water until her skin glowed, and with every act her guilt deepened. At night she lay awake listening to her heart pound, certain it was beating less for Japan and more for herself. Sachiko noticed. Her eyes, sharp as bayonets, missed nothing. "You grow soft," she told Aiko one evening as the women lay in their bunks. "Soon you will laugh at their music, you will thank them for their food. And when Japan calls, you will be deaf." Her words struck harder than any blow. Aiko wanted to argue, but silence betrayed her. The truth sat too heavy on her tongue. Maria Alvarez moved among the women like a quiet current, tending sores, checking fevers, teaching them to mend uniforms with threads that snapped more often than held. She carried no weapon, yet her gentleness unsettled them more than rifles ever could. To be cared for by the enemy was a wound of another kind, one stitched with kindness that left scars invisible yet deep. Collins, meanwhile, became a figure of contradiction. He joked with his fellow soldiers, tossed baseballs into the sky, and smoked while leaning against the wire. Yet sometimes Aiko caught him watching the women not with ridicule, but with a heaviness that mirrored her own. Once, when she dropped a sewing needle and bent to retrieve it, he stooped faster and handed it back, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a heat rushing up her spine that she could not name without shame. The fractures began subtly. One woman hoarded Coca-Cola caps beneath her mattress, convinced they carried luck. Another shredded hers, grinding the metal into the dirt, muttering curses as though destroying an idol. Arguments flared in whispers, then in shouts, over whether to drink the soda offered at mealtimes. "It is poison," one insisted. "It is survival," another replied. The debates divided the barracks more deeply than the wire divided camp from world. News filtered in through Red Cross inspectors and the mouths of guards. Bombings in Tokyo, shortages in Osaka, hunger gnawing at civilians back home. The women clutched these reports like knives against their hearts. To eat peaches in syrup while children in Japan starved, this contradiction became unbearable. Some refused meals for days, collapsing in fainting fits that forced Maria to intervene. Others ate twice as much, stuffing themselves as if they might consume enough to carry strength back across the ocean by sheer will. One evening, a package of letters arrived. They were heavily censored, words blacked out until sentences became riddles. Yet a few phrases slipped through: breadline, ashes of home, sister dead. Aiko read hers trembling, her mother's voice reduced to fragments. Her tears stained the page until the ink bled, turning words to shadows. When she looked up, she saw Sachiko holding her own letter close to her chest, her face as unreadable as stone. That night, Aiko dreamed of firestorms, of streets in Tokyo turned to rivers of flame. She woke gasping, clutching the blanket as if it were her mother's hand. Across the barracks, Sachiko's whisper carried, "Do you see now? They fatten us here while our families burn." The words twisted into her dream, branding themselves into her guilt. The camp itself changed as the season shifted. Rains came, drumming on tin roofs, turning paths to mud. The smell of wet earth mixed with grease from the kitchens, a combination both grounding and sickening. The women wrapped themselves in blankets, shivering not from cold but from restlessness. The Americans, too, seemed wearier, their laughter muted, their eyes shadowed by news of battles on distant islands. Collins grew sharper, less jovial, though sometimes at night his harmonica cut through the damp air with melodies that made even Sachiko pause. One afternoon, Maria gathered the women outside and taught them to play with scraps of cloth, fashioning dolls with button eyes. Laughter broke unexpectedly, high-pitched and girlish, startling the guards who turned their heads at the sound. For a few moments the barracks courtyard became a playground, not a prison yard. Aiko found herself laughing, the sound alien in her own mouth, until she noticed Sachiko's stare, accusing, unrelenting. The joy soured instantly. The fractures widened further when an American soldier brought in a photograph album. He showed it to Collins first, then passed it along. Pictures of wives in dresses, children waving from porches, families gathered around Thanksgiving tables heavy with food. When the album was left on a bench, Aiko dared glance. The photographs struck like blows, the warmth of smiling faces, the abundance of dishes, the absence of war carved into every detail. She turned away, dizzy with envy and rage. Sachiko spat on the ground near the album, muttering, "This is their victory, shame as sweet as sugar." Yet Aiko could not banish the images. They haunted her more than the barbed wire did. The tension in the barracks grew taut. Two women quarreled over a hidden peach slice, fists flying until guards intervened. Another attempted to hang herself with a bedsheet, saved only by Maria's quick hands. Rumors spread that anyone caught eating too eagerly was marked as traitor, that anyone refusing food would be rewarded in the afterlife. Neither belief brought peace. Collins confronted Aiko one evening near the laundry line. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "You're not prisoners the way you think," he said, though she barely understood the words. "This war's eaten us all alive." She stared, confused, but his eyes held something raw, grief, perhaps, or exhaustion. She wanted to ask, but the gulf of language held her silent. The transformations were not only within. The women began to carry themselves differently, some straighter, some more bent. Aiko caught her reflection in a tin basin one morning and barely recognized herself. Healthier, yes, but with eyes that carried two wars, one outside the wire, one within. She touched her face, wondering which war would claim her first. Sachiko, ever watchful, saw it too. "You are changing," she said, voice low but cutting. "They will erase you piece by piece until you belong to them. And then what will you be when Japan calls your name?" Aiko had no answer. The breaking point came during a meal when Collins, perhaps out of kindness, perhaps duty, set down an extra portion before her. Hunger surged, her hand reached, and in that instant Sachiko slammed her own tray onto the table. The clang silenced the room. "Look at her!" Sachiko shouted in Japanese. "She eats like one of them now. She smiles at their food, drinks their poison. She is no longer one of us." The women froze, eyes shifting between them. Aiko's throat tightened, shame burning her cheeks. She wanted to deny, to cry out that she still belonged. But the taste of beef lingered on her tongue, betraying her. Collins, bewildered, stepped back. Maria rushed in, scolding in both English and broken Japanese, trying to calm the storm. But the fracture was complete. The line between loyalty and survival had been drawn in grease and sugar. That night, Aiko lay awake, listening to the rain drum against the roof. The barracks were silent save for Sachiko's steady breathing, harsh even in sleep. Aiko pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the food settle there like a stone. In her chest, something else grew heavier, the knowledge that she was no longer the woman who had marched barefoot into this camp. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the wire, a new sound rose into the night sky, the low, growing hum of engines, carried on the wind. The rumor began as a whisper carried across the yard, faint as the rattle of palm fronds in the wind. An American holiday was approaching, though the women did not understand which one. The guard spoke of barbecue, of music, of crates stacked high. The word feast drifted into the barracks, and with it came unease. For some, it sounded like kindness. For others, like a trap. Aiko felt her stomach betray her at the thought. Hunger had never fully left her, not even after months of rations. Yet guilt shadowed each bite she took, and the idea of indulgence terrified her more than starvation. Across the room, Sachiko's face hardened as though carved from the wood of her bunk. "Do you not see?" she whispered fiercely. "They will laugh while we weep. They will make us thank them with our tears." The day arrived in a blaze of sunlight. Smoke rose from makeshift grills as beef hissed over flames. It sent drifting across the yard in waves that wrapped around the women like invisible ropes. Music blared from the gramophone, horns and drums colliding in jubilant bursts. Soldiers carried crates of Coca-Cola, the bottles stacked like glistening jewels, their glass sweating in the heat. The women were summoned into the square, guarded not by rifles raised but by eyes watchful, curious. Collins stood near the grills, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his freckles glowing in the firelight. He waved them forward with a strange mixture of command and encouragement. "Eat," he said, his drawl carrying both invitation and insistence. Maria Alvarez hovered nearby with her clipboard, her face tense, knowing how fragile the women's resolve had become. Plates were set down, buns warm, patties steaming, onions sliced sharp. The air itself seemed to pulse with temptation. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, one woman reached forward, trembling. She lifted the burger, bit down, and her body shook as tears streaked her face. Another followed, then another, sobs rising among the chewing as though sorrow had been baked into the bread. Aiko clutched her plate, her hands quivering. She stared at the food, its smell filling her lungs until she felt she might drown. Collins noticed her hesitation, stepped closer. "Ain't no trick," he murmured, softer than the others could hear. His eyes held no mockery, only a tired kind of urging. Something in his look pierced through her resistance. She lifted the burger, closed her eyes, and took a bite. Warmth spread through her chest, unbearable in its comfort. She began to cry, not the soft tears of relief but the heavy sobs of someone mourning the very act of survival. Across the fire, Sachiko refused her plate. She stared at the food with eyes blazing. At last she snatched it up and hurled it into the flames. The grease flared, sparks rising into the air. "This is poison," she screamed in Japanese. "We dishonor ourselves with every swallow." Her cry cut through the laughter, the music, the faint hum of joy that had dared to surface. The women froze mid-bite, shame spreading like wildfire. Maria rushed to calm her, placing a hand on her arm, but Sachiko wrenched away. Her grief poured out in fury, her voice sharp as shattered glass. "My husband died for honor. My people burn while you eat their food. Will you thank the enemy for killing your country?" Her words fell heavy, impossible to dismiss. Aiko's burger slipped from her fingers, falling to the dirt. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the taste on her tongue made any words a betrayal. She felt caught between two fires, the hunger that had driven her and the loyalty Sachiko demanded. And then, from the distance, came a sound that cleaved the moment in two, the wail of a siren, long and shuddering. Heads jerked upward. The drone of engines followed, low and insistent, vibrating through the ground. Shadows swept across the yard as Japanese planes cut through the sky. The feast shattered. Soldiers shouted, scrambling for cover. Plates clattered to the ground, food abandoned. The women screamed, some dropping flat to the dirt, others clutching one another as the first bombs thundered in the distance. Smoke rose on the horizon, black against the bright sky. Collins grabbed Aiko by the arm, pulling her toward the shelter of a trench. She resisted at first, then stumbled beside him, her body moving on instinct. Maria shouted in Spanish and English alike, shepherding women toward cover, her voice hoarse with urgency. Sachiko stood rigid for a moment, her face alight with something close to triumph as the sky roared with the engines of her countrymen. But when a bomb fell too close, the ground split with fire, and she too was thrown to her knees, clutching the earth as though it were the only unshakable thing left. In the chaos, Coca-Cola bottles shattered, glass scattering across the dirt, the sweet liquid mixing with mud and ash. Burgers lay crushed beneath boots, grease bleeding into the soil. The feast dissolved into fragments. Food and drink turned to debris beneath the thunder of war. Huddled in the trench, Aiko pressed her face into her hands. Around her, the women sobbed and clung to one another. Collins crouched nearby, rifle forgotten, his jaw clenched as he scanned the sky. For one surreal instant, Americans and Japanese lay shoulder to shoulder, united by nothing but fear. Aiko lifted her head, eyes wet, and saw Sachiko across from her. Their gazes locked. Neither spoke, but the silence between them held volumes. Sachiko's lips trembled, her eyes wet not with shame but with something rawer, almost human. In that moment, their conflict dissolved into the larger terror that engulfed them both. The sirens faded. The engines passed. The world grew quiet again, save for the crackle of fires on the horizon. Slowly, shakily, the prisoners rose from the trench. Smoke lingered in the air, bitter and acrid, clinging to their hair and clothes. The feast was gone. Only the memory remained, mingled now with the thunder of bombs. Aiko stood, unsteady, her heart still hammering. She tasted ash on her tongue, but beneath it, faint, stubborn, lingered the sweetness of Coca-Cola, the salt of beef. She hated it, yet clung to it, for it reminded her she was alive. Around her, the women gathered in silence, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Collins lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Maria wiped ash from her cheek, her expression unreadable. Sachiko finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They cannot feed us enough to erase who we are." But even as she said it, her body trembled, and her eyes drifted toward the horizon where fire still burned. Aiko lowered her gaze, pressing her hands to her stomach. She knew then that nothing inside her was simple anymore. Loyalty, survival, shame, hunger, all tangled together until she could not separate one from the other. The feast had not been mercy. It had been a mirror, showing them the war inside their own hearts. The night fell heavy, lit by distant flames. And as the women lay awake in the barracks, the echo of engines still rumbling in their ears, Aiko closed her eyes and understood with a clarity that chilled her. The war outside the wire was no longer the only one she had to survive.